Was she hidden in any way?
No.
An FBI spokesman was quoted as saying, at this point, they don't regard it necessarily as a kidnapping.
That sounds like kidnapping to me.
You've got to wonder what happened. Or was this a true attempt to
I don't know.
get
It
ransom?
It makes no sense.
You believe it's someone outside your home.
There is a killer on the loose.
Absolutely.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Gary Oliva, John Bonet, Christian Bruckner, Madeleine McCann. John Bonet, Oliva, Madeleine, Bruckner. Confessions, prime suspects, no evidence, imminent arrests, only for there to be no arrests, and both perpetrators already in prison anyway. I have a crazy theory. For those who know me, I'm not one for conspiracy theories. Usually I'm allergic to them. I'm also resistant to wild, unsubstantiated speculation. But here's a theory for what it's worth. I wonder whether Christian Bruckner was shooed in after Oliva's first run. Bear in mind, Oliva made headlines when it mattered 2 weeks before Christmas in 2016 on the 20-year anniversary of John Benet Ramsey's death. Then Oliva made a comeback again in 2018 and 2019. Then shortly after Christmas in 2019, on the seminal 25th anniversary, Gary Oliva was back once again with brand new breaking news. Of course, it was the same story all over again. But then eventually Boulder PD spoiled the party in January 2019 by releasing a statement refuting these media claims as hot air. Quote, "The Boulder Police Department is aware of Mr. Oliva and has investigated his potential involvement in this case, including several previous confessions. The department routinely receives information on this investigation. Information provided to the police department is reviewed along with the many tips and theories we receive. There are no new updates in this investigation, and the department will not comment further." Then, between 2020 and 2022, it was Bruckner's turn to play the role of pedophile patsy. Between roughly 2020 and 2022, the Madeleine McCann case suddenly saw a huge amount of traction regarding an apparently new suspect whom police had initially dismissed. Same thing as in the John Benet Ramsey case. Someone who was in the area at the time, someone who had made a confession. Never mind the fact that Christian Bruckner currently vigorously denies committing the crime. The bottom line is the world has been primed to look for a pedophile abductor, and here they were told was one. So it has to be him. Now, according to my poll on YouTube, and there were over 2,500 people who voted, the brouhaha around Bruckner has succeeded. Around a third of those polled believe Bruckner killed Madeleine McCann, even though he's not been charged or arrested in connection with that case, and despite the fact that there's no evidence whatsoever linking him to the scene, and Madeleine's remains haven't even been found. And so right now the question is, why is the John Benet Ramsey case suddenly flavor of the month again? Even Court TV is wading in, but of late, and take my word for it, we've been hearing quite a lot from John Ramsey as well. Why? Why now? Well, cue my theory. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, as I said earlier, I am doing a kind of a mini-series on this case, and I do think one's got to ask, why in the Madeleine McCann case and the John Benet Ramsey case are they officially unsolved? And if you say, well, in both cases, there's a mysterious stranger, right? And so everyone is looking for this mysterious stranger. they simply cannot find him. Both cases initially had the parents as suspects, but we're not going to look into that. Let's look into the stranger, and then they just never ever conclude the case. And then I think one might have reason to say, what is wrong with that strategy perhaps? Is there possibly a different strategy? And I think part of a different strategy is asking different questions. And one question, for example, that one could ask is, for example, in the John Benet Ramsey case, is what is the motive for the ransom note? The person who wrote the ransom note, what were they trying to do? What were they trying to achieve? And so we're going to be addressing some of those questions, trying to answer them in a kind of a brand new way. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So this is my theory. I suspect the McCanns, and by the way, I've written books on the McCann case and the John Benet Ramsey case. I've written at least a trilogy on each of these different cases. And so I suspect that the McCanns were aware of the Ramsey case during the investigation into their daughter's disappearance in 2007. Bear in mind, what happened to Madeleine happened roughly a decade after John Benet's death. And the John Benet Ramsey case made basically world headlines. It was one of the most famous cases in America and in American true crime. And is it any coincidence then that the Madeleine McCann case also became one of the most famous missing person cases in Britain and also in the world? In any event, just like the Ramseys, the McCanns early on found themselves under an umbrella of suspicion. Just like the Ramseys, there were times when the McCanns claimed the authorities no longer suspected them, only to be corrected. Just like the Ramseys, the McCanns took around 4 months to agree to be interviewed intensively by law enforcement. Just like the Ramseys, the McCanns focused a lot of their efforts on public relations. Just like the Ramseys, the McCanns brought out a book and participated in several documentaries that supported their case. Just like the Ramseys, the McCanns had a website and an online campaign which included fundraising. Both cases imagined a pedophile abductor, a stranger that broke in and moved their child, John Benet and Madeleine, from their beds. In both cases, there was virtually no evidence and no witnesses of an abductor. The statistics remain clear on this issue. Stranger abductions are and have been exceedingly rare. In any event, it's plain to see that there's plenty of intertextuality between both of these ultra-high-profile cases. Both involve unhappy endings for little girls, both involve rich, well-to-do parents, and both remain, apparently, unsolved despite investigations stretching across several decades. If the McCanns were aware of the Ramsey case from 2007 onwards, is there any doubt that John Ramsey wasn't aware of the Madeleine McCann case even in the last 1, 2, or 3 years? I'm bringing up the Ramseys and the McCanns here, but can you remember a single instance where the McCanns did that, where the McCanns brought up the John Benet Ramsey case, or the Ramseys brought up the McCann case? As early as September 14, 2007, the New York Times referenced the Ramseys in an article about the McCanns being regarded as suspects for the first time. This is a quote from that article, and I'll put a link to the article in the description. Quote, "But the news last week that the British girl's parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, had become suspects in her disappearance has added a shocking element of uncertainty to a public drama being played out in the surrealistic glare of the media. With the McCanns vehemently protesting their innocence and the Portuguese police claiming to have DNA evidence that incriminates them, the outcome of the case, if there is one, is said to be ugly. Did the McCanns accidentally kill their daughter and then mount an international publicity campaign to deflect attention? The tone of the media, until recently willing partners in the couple's bid to publicize their daughter's plight, has also grown less sympathetic. Reflecting a change of mood that only a week ago would have seemed impossible, some viewers and commentators have accused the press of being soft on the couple, whose publicity campaign has raised millions of dollars and drawn support from high-profile celebrities. This is still quoting from the article. Some people ask why we are providing them with a platform, Peter Horrocks, head of BBC News, wrote in a blog Wednesday. The McCanns have not been charged, but the case is beginning to hold early echoes of other unresolved disappearances. After JonBenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty pageant contender, was found murdered in her home in Boulder, Colorado in December 1996, suspicion fell on her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. The crime is unsolved. And that's where we end the quote from that article. So as early as 2007, you had the New York Times seeing a similarity between these two cases. Now, to test my hypothesis that John Ramsey might have been aware of the news surrounding a pedophile abductor who confessed and who recently was elevated to prime suspect, meanwhile the McCanns got on with their lives, and they did that while the public's attention was diverted. Let's have a look at some true crime news that Ramsey has responded to. And what I mean is true crime news, high-profile cases that aren't to do with his own story, their own story. So let's have a look. On December 15th last year, John Andrew Ramsey weighed in on the Idaho College murders. And this is what he said. He told Fox News, Moscow PD are in a near impossible position. They simply don't have the experience to run a complex homicide investigation, end quote. And then within 2 weeks of that interview, Brian Koberger had been apprehended. It turned out the cops were on his tail, or certainly on the tail of a white Hyundai, from day one. 6 days after his son, John Ramsey was beating exactly the same drum, also on the Idaho student case. In an article titled, Bring Out the Big Guns, JonBenet Ramsey's dad reveals why the chance of solving Idaho murders is low as he rips small-town policing failures. A quote from the article reads, but unless Moscow PD takes more of a back seat in the probe and allows the big guns to take control moving forward, John said he fears the chances of it being solved are pretty low, end quote. Well, within a week of that interview, Koberger had been caught, and it has to be said, the small-town cops of Moscow PD, I think, compiled a pretty detailed profile of Koberger's movements. Going back to the article, his skepticism, he says, is justified by his own experience dealing with a small, inexperienced police department in a convoluted case that garnered international attention, the murder of his daughter, JonBenet. Now, both the Ramseys and the McCanns accused the police of botching the investigation, and obviously how they botched it was by having the temerity to just suspect the people closest to the victim. And here we are, decades later, and the case is still unsolved. On December 20th, that's 2022, John Ramsey was on Fox News telling the cops not to let arrogance hinder the investigation. This is a quote from that article. Quote, the police are not going to be experienced to deal with that, and they don't have the resources to deal with it. And where Boulder failed so miserably, in our case, is they refused help that was immediately offered to them by other agencies who did have experience. End quote. If John thought Moscow, Idaho is going to be a poster child for what happened in Boulder, he was sorely mistaken. Not only did the small little department apprehend their suspect, but as mentioned earlier, they had been on his tail for some time. They even had the suspect's DNA. And on this question of DNA, I want to play a little clip.
We're certainly grateful for the effort that they've put into this case, continuing effort. The most significant thing to me was the fact that we now have pretty irrefutable DNA evidence, according to the DA's office.
That was 6 years ago, but even quite recently, John Ramsey was talking about DNA being kind of the smoking gun. But then in the last couple of weeks, it's all been about handwriting. And suddenly then it becomes, well, is there DNA on the ransom note? And let's talk about DNA. And of course, when you're talking about Gary Oliva, well, then you know from a mile away that you can't talk about DNA because his DNA doesn't match. So why are we talking about Gary Oliva? I thought it was a DNA case. I thought the DNA is irrefutable evidence. And so now you've got your suspect, testing for DNA. Well, if his DNA doesn't match, why are we talking about him? Why is he getting a platform? Why is all of this nonsense in the media? But coming back to the Idaho student case, one can see why that case resonated with the Ramseys, because it seemed to be a scenario where an intruder with zero connection to the victims broke in and did what he did. It's ironic that that seems to be the tune of the modern suspect for John Bonet, a complete stranger whom the Ramseys didn't know at all, didn't know from a bar of soap, except in multiple interviews with law enforcement, especially close to 1997 and 1998, the Ramseys agreed and insisted the only person who could have committed the crime would have been someone familiar with the house, someone who knew them and knew them well enough to harbor some sort of personal vendetta. Do you remember John Douglas, ex-FBI profiler, who basically said the profile of the killer in the Ramsey case is a young man or teen with a personal and specific grudge against John Ramsey? Then it's also been the Ramsey's theory that the suspect was familiar with the house. And so now I'm reading now from page 400 in the Ramsey's book, The Death of Innocence. Many people have speculated that the killer was familiar with the house. Our home had been open to the public a number of times for various charity events and parties. Around 2,000 visitors had streamed through our house during the Christmas 1994 historic Boulder Homes tour. It would not have been difficult for the future killer to roam through our place as part of one of those groups, even sneaking downstairs for a look at the basement area or upstairs to find John Bonet's bedroom. So in other words, what he's suggesting is that the killer was familiar with the house and had been to the house previously. Well, would they not have recognized someone like Gary Oliva? Would any of the other people who were in the house not have recognized him? And so why now has the person familiar with the inside of the house now changed to a stranger abductor? So we've spoken about John Ramsey and his son talking about the Idaho case. Well, as recently as mid-July this year, shortly after the arrest of Rex Heuermann, John Andrew Ramsey was in the news again, commenting on the similarity between the Long Island serial killer and the unknown killer of his sister. Here's a quote from the applicable article. No criminal record, but you can't hide this level of darkness. It will manifest itself in other areas of your life. That was what John Andrew Ramsey tweeted at the time. Then he said, try as you might, you can't blend. John Bonet's killer will likely have a similar bio. Now, I think it's fair to say that Heuermann was able to blend into society, including allegedly blending into his own family, which is why the case has gone unsolved for 13 years. So why this sudden focus on Gary Oliva this year? Well, we know in the Madeleine McCann case from about the 7th of June 2020 until September 2022, basically for 2 years, the world witnessed bumper-to-bumper headlines promising the imminent arrest of a prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case. What many didn't realize was that during this critical period, when the prime, quote-unquote, prime suspect was hogging the headlines, well, during this time, the European Court of Human Rights was evaluating a case brought to it by the McCanns. It was a case brought against the former lead detective. And so when the European Court ruled against the McCanns and in favor of the detective, a decision that was made public on September 20th, 2022, no one noticed. The result was published on Reuters, but British media wouldn't touch the story with a 10-foot pole. What should have been headlines, what should have made headlines, passed under the radar thanks to this endless barrage, this endless trumpeting of expectations surrounding a prime suspect. To cut a long story short, after 3 years of breathless anticipation, the prime suspect has not only not been charged, but is due to be released from prison in the near future. So you sort of had a repeat of the grand jury decision in Boulder, That happened in October 1999 in the John Benet Ramsey case, where people were manipulated, they were groomed to assume wrongly for years, and then it all turned out to be wrong.
So I made a decision, and it was wrong. It was a bad call, Ripley. It was a bad call. Bad call. Right.
Could something like that be happening in the John Benet Ramsey case? I don't know whether Boulder PD are getting ready to do DNA tests with more sophisticated equipment, and that could happen this year, next year, or in the next 5 years. What I do know is that they have a tiny amount of evidence to test, and with those results pending, suddenly Gary Oliva, who is a story dating back to 2002, more than 20 years ago, has been called back into service like a faithful foot soldier. He's once again contestant number 1 for the ridiculous intruder theory. What's really remarkable is after 26 years, Gary Oliva is the best intruder they've been able to come up with. And it's taken 26 years to sort of match his handwriting to the ransom note. They say a practice note was written. Well, I imagine there's been 26 years of practice to nail down the idiosyncrasies, and apparently there have been some. What is that saying? Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Well, even so, the Gary story has a long way to go to catch up to Madeleine McCann's fake prime suspect contestant of the moment. But maybe after 2 years of beating the same drum, maybe he'll get to the same 1/3 level. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do want to ask you, how well do you know the story about Patsy Ramsey's handwriting? You may have heard that some people thought that the ransom note was written by Patsy Ramsey, but do you know any more than that? Do you want to know more than that? Do you want to know how and why the investigation went into that area and what was being said at the time? If so, let me know, and I'll put together some analysis in that regard. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.